Richard Callahan had chosen Pine Hollow Estates for its serenity. The community was small, nestled between stands of old-growth oak and the glistening curve of Lake Willowmere. When he first saw the property, a cedar-framed house with 60 feet of direct lakefront access, he knew it was home. At 65, with a career in civil engineering behind him and a future of quiet mornings ahead, it was everything he wanted. Each day began the same. Richard rose with the sun, brewed black coffee, and stepped out onto his weathered dock. He'd cast a line into the misty water, listened to the birds, and let time meander. The lakefront was his sanctuary. He had shaped it with his own hands. A curved stone path winding down to water, a border of native flowers that attracted butterflies, a small dock perfectly aligned with the sunrise. It was private, it was peaceful, and it was his, or so he thought. The trouble began with a change in leadership. Karen Whitmore, a trim, silver-haired woman with a stiff smile and a relentless gait, was elected president of the Pine Hollow Homeowners Association. A former real estate agent with a penchant for power, Karen viewed the neighborhood as a showroom and the residents as props that needed constant rearranging. Karen's first act as HOA president was to send a newsletter titled Pine Hollow, A New Era. It featured a list of upcoming revisions to community guidelines, standardized mailboxes, height restrictions for hedges, and a new community stewardship initiative concerning shared green spaces. At first, Richard dismissed it. HOA overreach was common in neighborhoods like this, and he lived long enough to know most battles weren't worth fighting. But then came the envelope, a crisp, cream-colored notice tucked in his mailbox. Dear Mr. Callahan, it has come to the attention of the HOA board that the lakeside access behind your property, while enjoyed as a private amenity, is not officially deeded to your lot. According to our updated bylaws, Section 8.7, ratified July 12th, all lakeside access is considered community property. As such, the dock, landscaping, and private path must be removed within 14 days to maintain compliance. Richard read the letter twice, then once more. The language was cold, absolute. He picked up the phone and dialed the number on the bottom of the page. Karen answered on the second ring. Pine Hollow HOA, this is Karen. This is Richard Callahan. I just received your notice. There must be some mistake. That lakefront access was a major factor in my purchase. It's listed in my original agreement. There was a pause, the sound of clicking keys. Well, Mr. Callahan, previous agreements may be outdated. The new bylaws clarify stewardship over all communal areas, including the lake perimeter. That's not clarification, that's theft. I assure you, it's well within our jurisdiction. The community must take precedence over individual preferences. The call ended with polite venom, and Richard stared out the window at his dock, his flowers, his path, all suddenly claimed by a committee he never cared to join. He brought his paperwork to the next HOA meeting, a gathering held in the sterile clubhouse at the center of Pine Hollow. Karen sat ahead of a long table, flanked by board members who nodded silently through every point she made. I have here the original documents from the sale, Richard said, standing before them. They describe an exclusive recreational easement extending from my property to the waterline. Karen flipped through his packet with a painted fingernail, then held up the HOA's newly minted bylaw revisions. These documents supersede any previous informal arrangements. The board has unanimously agreed to reclaim all lakefronts for communal use. We need to maintain fairness and consistency. Richard's jaw tightened. No one even uses that part of the lake. This is punitive. I'm sorry you feel that way, she said, smiling without warmth. A week later, he returned home to find pink tags stapled along his dock. The landscaping he'd nurtured for years was flagged for removal. HOA contracted workers arrived without warning and began uprooting native plants and dismantling the rock path. Richard stood by, powerless, his protests ignored. He contacted a lawyer, filed an appeal, and requested an emergency injunction. But the HOA was prepared. The revised bylaws, legally ambiguous and questionably ratified, gave them just enough ground to defend their actions. Every delay worked in their favor. The dock was dismantled within 2 weeks. His shoreline transformed from cultivated haven to blank, generic grass, stripped of personality, devoid of care. The final blow came in the form of an invoice, charges for the restoration and removal of unauthorized structures. Richard was being billed for the destruction of his own sanctuary. He didn't attend the next HOA meeting. He didn't call his lawyer again. That night, he poured himself a glass of bourbon and stood barefoot on the edge of the once lively garden, staring at the sterile void left behind. He thought about the hours he'd spent building that dock, the spring mornings spent fishing, the neighbors who once complimented his wildflowers. They had taken it all, but they had made a mistake. They'd thought he was just another retiree with time and opinions. They'd forgotten he was an engineer. He didn't yell, didn't threaten, didn't break any laws. Instead, he walked into his garage, pulled out his drafting table, and began to design. Not revenge, not chaos, a message. He sketched until dawn, and when the first light of morning touched the stripped earth outside, Richard Callahan knew exactly what came next. It began with deliveries. Long trucks rolled into Pine Hollow each morning, unloading pressure-treated timber, steel anchors, and industrial-grade sealant. Neighbors slowed their morning jogs to gawk as Richard, clad in work gloves and a faded canvas jacket, supervised construction from his back porch. By the end of the week, the foundation posts were set. Massive beams sunk into reinforced concrete at precise intervals. The structure rising from them wasn't your average fence. This was a statement. 9 feet tall, buttressed, and impenetrable, a monument to defiance. Karen came storming down the back easement on the 4th day. "Mr. Callahan," she called, heels crunching indignantly over gravel. "This structure violates HOA aesthetics." Richard barely looked up from his plans. The guidelines specify a maximum height of 10 feet for backyard fencing and prohibit masonry. This is wood, reinforced, but entirely compliant. It obstructs the view from the shared lake path, which, according to you, is not my property. That makes it none of my concern. She pursed her lips, eyes scanning the growing wall with visible disdain. This isn't in the spirit of community living. Neither is having your garden ripped out without consent. By the end of the 2nd week, the wall was complete, towering, seamless, and finished in deep weather-resistant stain. Karen filed 3 complaints. Each was dismissed on technical grounds. Richard had built it by the book. Then came the paint. Using projector at night and scaffolding by day, Richard painted massive block letters across the lake-facing side. HOA Land Grab. Stark white against the dark stain, the words could be read from 50 yards away. Neighbors gathered to watch. Some filmed it. Others brought coffee and sat in lawn chairs. No one intervened. Karen called an emergency board meeting. Richard wasn't invited, but within hours of it ending, every mailbox received a letter. "Dear residents, the HOA is aware of recent unauthorized messaging displayed on private property and is evaluating options for resolution. We ask for continued patience during this time." Richard printed the letter and stapled it beneath the mural. The wall became a landmark. Locals outside Pine Hollow began driving by to see it. Someone added the location to Google Maps under the tag Land Grab Wall. Karen doubled down. She pushed for a new rule banning large signage visible from communal areas. But the motion failed. The vote was split, and several newer board members abstained. Behind the scenes, Richard's act had awakened something in the community. Neighbors, once apathetic, now questioned board decisions. A petition began circulating demanding a review of Karen's leadership. And quietly, a second figure entered the story. Mariana Perez, a deputy attorney general in the county's Consumer Affairs Division, had received 3 separate complaints about Pine Hollow in the past year. Richard's wall and the documents he forwarded put all into perspective. Unbeknownst to Karen, the wall wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Karen Whitmore prided herself on control. For 15 years, she'd micromanaged everything from hedge height to garage paint tones. But standing in the community clubhouse staring at grainy drone footage of Richard Callahan's wall plastered across the evening news, her control began to fracture. The story had gone viral. The phrase, HOA Land Grab, was trending online. Commentators weighed in on overreaching homeowners associations. Richard, whether you want to be or not, had become a symbol, a quiet David against a bureaucratic Goliath. What rattled Karen most wasn't the media attention. It was a growing silence within the board. Vice President Alan Riggs, once her dependable second-in-command, no longer returned her calls. Treasurer Kelly Mendoza began forwarding board emails to legal review before responding. And then there was a petition. It started with a clipboard pass around at the HOA's summer picnic. By the following week, it was digital, hosted on a popular community rights platform. The language was sharp. We, the undersigned, call for a special vote to audit the legality of recent HOA bylaw changes and to consider new board leadership. No more shadow meetings. No more land grabs. By week's end, 61% of homeowners had signed, enough to trigger an internal vote. Karen responded by calling a closed-door emergency session. Only 3 board members showed up. 2 of them resigned. Meanwhile, Richard remained quiet. He continued to trim his lawn. He painted over graffiti someone had scrawled beneath his wall mural. Bitter old man, in the same white that spelled HOA Land Grab. He didn't speak to news crews camped near the neighborhood entrance. He didn't argue at meetings or give speeches. Instead, he documented every letter, every invoice, every moment from the first notice to final removal of his dock. He stored them in a thick binder labeled Exhibit A. When Mariana Perez knocked on his door, she introduced herself with a badge and a clipboard. Mr. Callahan, I'm investigating allegations of HOA misconduct filed with the county. Your name appears in 3 of them. Mind if I ask a few questions? Richard invited her in. They sat at his dining room table while the lake shimmered through the wide back windows. The very lake he was no longer permitted to touch. I've got copies of everything, he said, sliding the binder toward her. Mariana flipped through the contents, eyebrows rising. You were an engineer? 32 years. State certified. Built infrastructure from Baltimore to Birmingham. I know how to read bylaws. She smiled. That explains offense. Over the course of 2 hours, Mariana confirmed what Richard suspected. Multiple HOA revisions had been pushed through without the required supermajority vote. Financial decisions were being made without transparent accounting. Karen's authority had grown unchecked through legal gray zones. If half of this holds up, she said, this HOA could be in for state-level scrutiny, maybe even a forced audit. That night, Mariana filed her initial findings with the Consumer Affairs Division. A formal inquiry was opened. Karen was served notice the following Monday. The walls, Richard's and Karen's, were both closing in. She reacted the only way she knew how, with escalation. A new letter circulated. This one claimed that Richard's wall now violated a revised clause on negative community branding. Residents were instructed to file anonymous complaints if they found the structure hostile, offensive, or threatening. 30 complaints arrived, most anonymous, many clearly forged. One was from Burt Lake Person. Another, Sandra Docklover. The tactic backfired. Within 48 hours, screenshots of the complaints, leaked by a disillusioned board member, surfaced online. Karen's handwriting matched multiple submissions. That was the final crack. At the HOA special vote held under community supervision, Karen was officially removed by a vote of 71%. But Richard wasn't there to see it. He was on the phone, speaking quietly with Mariana. Her investigation had unearthed something deeper, a series of quiet land reassessments that had taken place years prior. The HOA had been slowly redrawing property lines to incorporate peripheral land, like Richard's shoreline, under communal control. The deeds had never been properly recorded with the county, and thanks to Richard's meticulous documentation, Mariana had proof that he and others still held rightful ownership. In legal terms, fraud. In human terms, theft. Mariana gave him the news. We'll be filing a corrective action motion. If it goes through, you'll get your shoreline back. Your dock. Everything. Richard exhaled, slow and deliberate. And the others? They'll be notified. Some of them don't even realize what was taken yet. Richard stood at his window that evening, bourbon in hand, watching the sun sink over Lake Willowmere. His fence stood firm. His mural gleamed. And beneath it, the tide had shifted. Fall arrived early in Pine Hollow that year. The air turned sharp, and yellow leaves drifted down like slow confetti. blanketing the yards in gold. For the first time in months, there was peace. Karen Whitmore had disappeared from the neighborhood within a week of her removal. Her house went dark. A for sale by owner sign planted crooked in the front lawn. Rumors flew. She was suing the county. She'd moved to Florida. She'd joined another HOA in a gated community near Raleigh. But Richard didn't care. She was gone. The new HOA board was different. Younger, more transparent. They hosted open meetings with rotating moderators. Alan Riggs, the former vice president, stepped in his interim chair, but insisted on term limits and community voting. The first motion passed, a rollback of all ambiguous bylaw changes made during Karen's tenure. But the true victory came 2 weeks later. Richard received a certified letter from the county. It was short, bureaucratic, and perfect. Following a review of documentation and in accordance with state property law, the land abutting Lake Willowmere, previously designated as common area, has been reassigned to the original property owner, Richard J. Callahan. All easements, access, and rights are fully restored. He read it twice, then set it on the kitchen counter beside a mug of still warm coffee. A quiet smile crept across his face. Later that afternoon, he walked outside for the first time in days without gloves or tools. He didn't need to build anymore. He didn't need to defend. The wall still stood, tall and resolute, but it served its purpose. It wasn't about the fence. It never had been. It was about the line between stewardship and control, between community and coercion. Richard hadn't just drawn it. He had built it. And now, the lake was his again. By winter, he had restored the dock. It wasn't the same as the original, but that didn't matter. It had the same bones, cedar planks, sealed edges, a bench facing east toward the rising sun. He replanted native grasses and set a few flat stones back into place, recreating the winding path that led from his back porch to the shore. Neighbors stopped by more frequently. Some came with pies, others with handshakes. A few simply stood at the edge of the property, hands in pockets, and nodded in quiet respect. I didn't think anyone could stand up to her. One neighbor, Tom, said. We all just kind of let it happen. You stood up, Richard replied, the moment you stopped staying quiet. The wall remained up through winter. Some suggested it be taken down now that the lakefront was legally his again, but Richard kept it. And then, one morning in spring, he painted over the mural. In its place, he stenciled new words. Lake Willowmere belongs to every voice that speaks. That day, Mariana Perez returned to visit. She brought a folder with finalized legal documents and a manila envelope containing a formal commendation from the state for civic vigilance and advocacy. I've never had a case wrap up so cleanly, she said, handing him the documents. You made our job easy. I just followed the blueprints, Richard replied. She smiled. There's talk in the office of drafting clearer HOA oversight guidelines. You might have helped change the way things work for a lot of people. He nodded slowly. Good. Then maybe it was worth it. She left shortly after. Richard stood beside the mural and watched the lake for a long time. The water was calm again. A few ducks floated past the dock, and somewhere in the reeds, a turtle surfaced to catch the sun. The neighborhood was different now. The wall no longer divided. It reminded of what had happened, of what could happen again, but also of what was possible when one person stood firm, not with rage or recklessness, but with precision and patience. And when enough people listened, as summer returned, so did the lake's rhythm. Families picnicked, kids launched kayaks. The grass grew thick and green again, and Richard, as he always had, rose with the sun, poured a cup of black coffee, and walked barefoot down the stone path to his dock. This time, he brought a second chair, because he knew there'd always be someone new, someone curious, someone ready to ask, what's the story with the wall? And he'd tell them, because some lines are worth drawing twice.